Picture, if you will, the diary of the leader of the free world. A man whose schedule is mapped out to the very minute. Summits with heads of state, national security briefings, managing the greatest economy on the planet. Yet, amidst these global obligations, there is one date circled in thick red marker. A date that became a proper obsession for him. A totem, an absolute fixation. The 15th of May. For Donald Trump, from the very first hours following his second inauguration, this day morphed into a symbol of long-awaited liberation. It was the day when, in his fevered imagination, the shackles were meant to fall. Shackles placed on him not by Congress, nor by political opponents, nor the press. This was liberation from one specific bloke, a man by the name of Jerome J. Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve of the United States of America, which is to say, de facto, the chief banker of the world. We stand at a crossroads. What is unfolding right now behind the closed doors of Washington is not merely a dull dispute amongst financiers about interest rates. The story of the Federal Reserve is transforming right before our eyes into a political thriller that would make Hollywood scriptwriters blush. At stake is a fundamental question. Will the independence of the American economy, and therefore the global financial system, be sacrificed to the political ambitions of one man? Or are we witnessing the final, desperate, and heroic stand of a man with an unyielding iron spine? Settle in, put the kettle on, and pour yourself a cuppa. Today we are diving into an unprecedented tale of colossal pressure, astronomical sums of money, threats of imprisonment, and pure human resolve. If you are keen to know how political scheming of this magnitude affects global markets, high street prices, and your personal savings, do make sure to subscribe to our channel, drop a like on this video, and ring the bell. Let us begin. To grasp the sheer depth and ferocity of this battle, we must look closely at the main players. This is not just a spat between two civil servants. It is a collision of two entirely different universes, philosophies, and walks of life. In one corner of the ring is Donald Trump, a man who built his reputation, his empire, and his political brand in the brutal, bare-knuckle world of New York property development. Trump is a developer to his very marrow. In his worldview, absolutely everything is a transaction. For a property tycoon, loans are oxygen. Cheap money and low interest rates are the petrol that powers the excavators, builds the skyscrapers, and drives the stock markets up. Trump genuinely believes the economy should run like a motor car with the accelerator firmly pressed to the floor, and that the central bank is obliged to fund this party with cheap money, especially during his presidency. In the opposing corner sits Jerome Powell, 73 years old, cut from an entirely different cloth. Powell is the quintessence of Washingtonian aristocracy, the so-called blue blood of the mid-20th century. He followed in the footsteps of his solicitor father, passing through the hallowed corridors of the American elite. The prestigious Georgetown Prep School, then Princeton University, followed by Georgetown Law. This was followed by a steady, methodical ascent in the world of investment banking during those very years when the sector was ballooning with colossal wealth in the 80s and 90s. Today, Powell's personal fortune is estimated at somewhere between $20 and $50 million. He resides in Chevy Chase, a quiet, leafy, and absurdly expensive suburb of Maryland, just north of the capital. Despite all his wealth and influence, Powell has always remained a distantly polite apparatchik, almost invisible to the general public. He is a classic institutional Republican who, like many Americans of the baby boomer era, has retained an unshakable, almost religious devotion from his youth to the psychedelic rock band, the Grateful Dead. His world of quiet backroom chats, academic graphs, and measured decisions is miles away from the loud, aggressive showbiz style of property developers in which Trump is accustomed to operating. Powell is a monolith, a man of steely cold hauteur concealed behind a polite smile. The paradox of this tale is that it was Donald Trump himself who, to his immense, excruciating, and long-lasting regret, appointed Powell as chairman of the Fed in 2019, breaking the tradition of reappointing the bank's chiefs from previous administrations. Trump thought he was putting a loyal Republican in the post. Instead, he got a brick wall against which all his orders shattered. Their relationship was icy from the very start. Powell, remaining absolutely deaf to all the president's maneuvers, refused to cut interest rates to suit the administration's economic and political program. Trump tried the lot, early cajoling over the phone, fierce insistence through aides, public mockery on Twitter, and insulting nicknames. Nothing worked. The tension between the two most powerful men in the American economy reached boiling point on a sweltering Washington afternoon last July, 2025. The heat was practically melting the tarmac on Constitution Avenue. Picture this genuinely surreal scene. The President of the United States and the head of the independent central bank strolling together to inspect a massive construction site, the renovation of the Federal Reserve's main headquarters. Both men clad in sharp, expensive, dark suits, and both donning blindingly white plastic builders' hard hats. They stood in the middle of a vast, echoing, unfinished cavern, surrounded by scaffolding, concrete dust, and a barrage of television camera lenses. The sight was unintentionally comical. Two elderly billionaires in suits and hard hats in the middle of a building site. But absolutely no one present was laughing. You could have cut the atmosphere with a knife. Trump, possessing a feral instinct for television imagery and knowing full well the cameras were capturing every syllable, decided to use the moment for a public dressing down. His aim was to cause Powell maximum embarrassment, painting him as an incompetent squanderer of the public purse. The project's budget was indeed astronomical, around $2.5 billion. Trump had frequently and loudly voiced his disbelief at this figure, deeming it utterly absurd. It's looking like $3.1 billion. The price went up a little bit, or maybe a lot, the president tossed out, gesturing carelessly at the concrete vaults as if pricing a refit for one of his casinos. Powell, shooting Trump a frankly bewildered and slightly disdainful glance, slowly shook his head. There was not an ounce of fear or submission in his voice. "I am not aware of that, Mr. President." And then, Trump did what he does best. He put on a theater show. Like a conjurer pulling a rabbit from a top hat, he slowly retrieved a neatly folded piece of paper from the breast pocket of his jacket. He handed it to Powell with the air of a prosecutor presenting an irrefutable piece of evidence. Powell, his face completely deadpan, took the paper. He examined it closely with academic meticulousness, and then, dismissively, almost with distaste, handed it right back to the president. Powell coldly pointed out that Trump's figures were manipulative. That $3.1 billion included the cost of the adjacent Martin building, a renovation that had been fully completed 5 whole years ago. Trump was deliberately conflating two separate budgets to drum up a scandal. "It's part of the overall work," Trump stubbornly pressed on, staring straight ahead into the camera lenses, ignoring the facts. "It's not new work," Powell insisted firmly, refusing to break his gaze. In that fleeting moment, they didn't look like the arbiters of the global economy, but rather like a pair of cranky, aging flatmates squabbling on camera over whose turn it was to take out the rubbish. Yet this brief, awkward episode is incredibly instructive. It laid bare the very essence of their standoff. Powell had found within himself that reserve of steely, aristocratic hauteur to stand under the studio lights and calmly tell the President of the United States, "You are lying." Whilst the summer brought mere verbal spats and playing to the gallery, by January 2026, the stakes became frighteningly, deadly serious. The games were over. A war of annihilation had begun. Let us recall exactly what sort of month that was. January of this year will go down in the history books as perhaps the most utterly mad and hyperactive month in the life of the Trump administration, which was already operating at a superlative level of chaos. Remember those freezing weeks? The news cycle was saturated with stories, any one of which would normally have been the scandal of the decade. Nighttime shootings on the snow-covered streets of Minneapolis during brutal ice raids. Shocking revelations of a covert military raid into Venezuelan territory. Diplomatic rows and open threats to seize Greenland by force, leaving European NATO allies in a state of absolute horror and stupor. In this maelstrom of global chaos and screaming headlines, it was terribly easy for the public to miss one event that, nevertheless, shook the financial world to its very foundations. In the quiet governmental quarters of Washington, a step was taken that had absolutely no precedent in the entire 113-year history of the United States. The Department of Justice, controlled by the executive branch, officially served the Federal Reserve with grand jury subpoenas. Yes, you heard that correctly. The head of the independent central bank was threatened with actual criminal indictments and the very real prospect of ending up behind bars. The formal pretext? To any solicitor or economist, it seemed not just contrived, but frankly absurd. It all revolved around those testimonies Jerome Powell gave to the Senate Banking Committee in June 2025. He was grilled mercilessly back then over the budget for that ill-fated building renovation on Constitution Avenue. The administration was trying to stitch him up for perjury before Congress or financial fraud regarding the construction budget. But the true reason was blindingly obvious to everyone in Washington. How did it come to pass that the president of the world's greatest economy attempted to set federal prosecutors on the central bank? The answer lies in obsession. The threat of criminal charges was being used as blatant blackmail. It was an attempt to break Powell, to force him to resign, or, even better for Trump, to frighten him into drastically slashing interest rates ahead of crucial economic reports. Trump wanted cheap money. Powell stood in his way. Consequently, Powell had to be locked up or his reputation utterly destroyed. Any other civil servant, confronted with the terrifying might of the Department of Justice and the threat of losing their liberty, reputation, and fortune, would likely have struck a deal. They would have tendered their resignation for family reasons and quietly slipped into the shadows. But Powell did not flinch. When those grand jury subpoenas arrived in January, he did not stay silent, hide behind an army of corporate solicitors, or issue dry press releases. He launched a frontal assault. Powell convened a press conference and delivered his own statement straight down the camera lens. His words, spoken in the flat, emotionless tone of a professional banker, struck like a thunderbolt on Wall Street and in the Capitol. This new threat has not the slightest relation to my testimony last June, nor to the renovations of the Federal Reserve buildings, Powell declared, enunciating every syllable. This does not concern Congress's oversight rules. The Fed did everything possible to keep Congress informed. These are all pretexts. Powell looked directly into the camera lenses, addressing not just the journalists, but the global markets. The threat of criminal charges is a direct consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than serving the political preferences of the president. It was an historic moment. The chairman of the Fed had publicly accused the President of the United States of attempting illegal coercion through the fabrication of criminal cases. Powell brought the issue to a head, outlining an existential threat to the entire system. Would the U.S. central bank be able to continue relying on hard economic data, statistics, and science? Or would the monetary policy of the world's leading economy henceforth be governed by political pressure, blackmail, and common bullying from the Oval Office? These unprecedented legal threats sparked genuine panic in the financial world. Markets adore stability, and a president waging war against his own central bank is a recipe for unmitigated disaster. Outrage flared up on both sides of the political divide in Congress. Even those who routinely criticized his financial policies rallied to Powell's defense. One of the most striking moments occurred during J.P. Morgan's quarterly earnings call with its investors. The bank's legendary chief executive, Jamie Dimon, a man whose word on Wall Street often carries more weight than the president's, openly stood up for the Fed chairman. Dimon told the press that whilst he didn't always agree with every decision the central bank made, he held enormous, colossal respect for Jay Powell as a man and a professional. And it is little wonder. Powell's reputation in the financial world had been built over decades. He had served the country under 4 different administrations. He was an undersecretary of the Treasury in the White House under George H.W. Bush, then sat on the Fed's Board of Governors under the Democrat Barack Obama. Only then did Trump appoint him as chairman, a post he managed to retain throughout the turbulent years of the Biden administration. Powell was the living embodiment of the continuity and stability of American institutions. And it was precisely this stability that Trump was now attempting to snap over his knee. But the American state system, with all its checks and balances, began to mount a fierce resistance. The president had presumed that the mere mention of a grand jury would compel everyone to bow their heads. He was sorely mistaken. Trump, realizing that Powell's days as chairman were formally drawing to a close in May, by that very date, the 15th of May, had already selected his replacement in advance. That man was Kevin Warsh. The White House had hoped to usher his nomination through the Senate swiftly and without a fuss. But the nomination process suddenly hit a brick wall. It was blocked. And who dared to defy the president? It wasn't an opposition Democrat. It was a Republican senator from North Carolina, Tom Tillis. Tillis issued an unprecedented statement. He made it unequivocally clear to the administration, as a member of the relevant committee, he would not approve a single federal nominee for financial posts, including Kevin Warsh, until these fabricated, politically motivated criminal charges against Jerome Powell were dropped entirely. By the standards of the modern Republican Congress, where loyalty to Trump is often a matter of sheer political survival, this was an incredibly bold, almost suicidal challenge to the White House. But the fact of the matter is, Senator Tillis had absolutely nothing to lose. His senatorial term expires in January 2027. He had already announced he would not stand for re-election. Liberated from the tedious necessity of appeasing party bosses and raising campaign funds, Tillis was free to act entirely on his conscience and defend the institutions of the state. Pressure from Wall Street and a mutiny within his own Senate forced the administration to backpedal. By late April, the rather odious Attorney General Jeanine Pirro, a longtime Trump ally, was forced to face the press and announce the closure of this scandalous case. Senator Tillis, considering his mission accomplished, greenlit Warsh's nomination, stating publicly that the investigation into the Fed was completely and fully ended. Yet, as is so often the case in politics, words proved merely to be a smokescreen. In early May, whilst appearing on a conservative television channel, Pirro dropped a sudden and rather opaque hint that the Department of Justice might have merely shelved the files, and could be keenly interested in resurrecting the charges against the Fed's leadership at some undefined point in the future, should new circumstances arise. This vague insinuation, this sword of Damocles left dangling in the air, provoked Powell into a counterstroke. A move absolutely no one expected from the conservative, restrained banker. Mid-May, Jerome Powell's final press conference as chairman of the Federal Reserve. The room was absolutely heaving with journalists from across the globe. The air was electric. Everyone was waiting to see what Powell would say as his parting shot, heading off into retirement under a hail of presidential insults. He began predictably and dryly. Powell announced the board's decision. The central bank would hold the base interest rate at its previous high level, between 3.5% and 3.75% per annum. This was the third consecutive time they had done so. Trump, who had been demanding cheap money, received a firm rebuff in the very final days of Powell's tenure. And then, Powell dropped an absolute bombshell. Staring straight into the cameras, he calmly confirmed his intention: not to go anywhere. Yes, his term as chairman was expiring, but he possessed the legal right to remain on the board of directors as an ordinary governor, and he fully intended to exercise that right. A governorship comes with an enormously long term, and Powell has a legally secure seat in that chair right up until January 2028. That means he will be present at every meeting, voting on rates, and maintaining access to all internal documents for nearly 2 more years, spanning the entirety of Trump's presidential term. This decision is utterly, incredibly unorthodox. The last Fed chairman to voluntarily demote himself to an ordinary member of the Board of Governors after stepping down from the top job was Mariner Eccles. And that happened back in 1948, nearly 80 years ago, during the Truman administration. The administration's reaction was instantaneous and furious. The newly minted Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, immediately issued a blistering statement, slamming Powell's decision as an outrageous breach of all the unwritten norms and ethics of the Federal Reserve System. Donald Trump himself, trying with all his might to feign indifference, simply could not resist launching into a furious tirade on his social media. Jerome Too Late Powell just wants to stay at the bank because the loser can't get a job anywhere else. Nobody in the private sector wants him. But the notion that a man of Powell's stature clings to a civil servant's chair for the money or out of a fear of unemployment is utterly laughable to anyone with even a passing understanding of the American elite. As previously mentioned, Powell's personal wealth, amassed at the Carlyle Group Investment Fund, is estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. Against that backdrop, his government salary as Fed chairman, roughly $250,000 a year, is an absolute pittance. The biggest banks on Wall Street would have bitten his hand off, offering multi-million-dollar retainers just to have him listed as an advisor. At the press conference, Powell made his true motives crystal clear, without a hint of a smile. He is staying because he is afraid. He isn't afraid for himself. He fears for the integrity, survival, and independence of the institution to which he has devoted 14 years of his life. I will retire when I think it is appropriate to do so, Powell stated, his words clipped and precise. Let me be clear. I am staying literally because of the actions that have been taken against us. I had long planned to retire, play some golf, and spend time with my family. But the events of the past 3 months have left me no moral choice but to stay and see this through. I am concerned. These legal attacks by the administration, these attempts to bring criminal charges over rate policy, are unprecedented in our 113-year history. Verbal criticism is one thing. Yes, that is normal. But threats of prison are another entirely. I genuinely worry that these relentless attacks are battering the very foundation of our institution. Of course, to remain entirely objective, we must concede that Powell's legacy at the helm of the Fed sparks fierce, occasionally brutal debate within economic circles. Opinions are divided strictly down partisan and ideological lines. Powell is far from a saint, and he has made monumental blunders. On the one hand, his defenders point to a phenomenal success in the labor market. Under Powell's watch, the U.S. recorded its lowest unemployment rate amongst all Fed chairmen since 1978. America was working. Jobs were being created. But on the flip side, and this is precisely what every American feels when popping to the supermarket, it was under Powell that the country faced its third highest level of inflation in modern history. The dollar was rapidly bleeding its purchasing power. The primary and highly justified grievance against Powell is that he reacted far too sluggishly, unforgivably slowly. When the U.S. economy began to boom following the global COVID freeze, prices started creeping up. Yet throughout 2021, Powell and his team chanted a single mantra: inflation is transitory. They insisted that the rapid price hikes were merely down to temporary supply chain bottlenecks, cargo ships marooned in ports, and a severe shortage of microchips. Despite deafening, panicked warnings from independent economists that the economy was overheating on free money, the Fed's board stubbornly refused to raise the base rate from 0 right up until March 2022. They missed the boat entirely. And when inflation broke off its leash, reaching multi-year highs, the Fed was forced to slam violently on the brakes, hiking rates sky high and rendering mortgages and loans utterly unaffordable for millions of families. Consequently, it was inflation that became the fatal deciding issue in the 2024 presidential election. The spiraling costs of eggs, petrol, and housing doomed the weak, unpopular Biden-Harris ticket to a crushing defeat. Voters, thoroughly fed up with their empty wallets, bought into the returned Donald Trump's loud promises to slash prices swiftly and make America affordable once more. However, to the immense disappointment of the electorate, and of Trump himself, having retaken the Oval Office, he couldn't just wave a magic wand and make it happen. Prices did not return to their 2019 levels. Hence his blind, raging fury directed at the Fed. Trump desperately needed a scapegoat. He demanded that Powell aggressively slash borrowing costs to conjure the illusion of an economic boom. But Powell flatly refused, fully aware that cheap money would instantly spark a second, even more devastating wave of inflation. And the central bank's task was further complicated by Trump's erratic, chaotic tariff wars with the rest of the world, including China, Europe, and Mexico, which in themselves were driving up the cost of imported goods. Economists have yet to fully assess the sheer fallout from those turbulent COVID and post-COVID years. But the staggering, explosive rise in house prices and soaring rents has permanently upended the lives of several generations of Americans. Millennials and Gen Z find themselves completely locked out of the American dream of getting on the property ladder. Fueled by this anger, the Conservative Heritage Foundation, the right-wing think tank and chief architects of the scandalous Project 2025 manifesto, even published a hefty analytical dossier bearing the sensational headline, Problematic Powell, What to Do with the Worst Fed Chair in U.S. History. Nevertheless, within academic circles, there are other, far more nuanced views. John Cochrane, a prominent economist and Stanford University professor from the prestigious Hoover Institution, begs to differ. According to his rather robust calculations, the primary inflationary damage was inflicted not by Fed policy, but by the unprecedented scale of government support programs during the COVID pandemic, both under Trump in 2020 and Biden in 2021. Let's face facts. The government essentially printed and handed out $5 trillion to the public. $5 trillion without any actual plan on how to claw this money back or back it with goods, Professor Cochrane stated. People received their checks and tried to spend them in an economy where, due to lockdowns, there was a severe shortage of goods. It's textbook economics. Too much money chasing too few goods. They drove the prices up themselves. The fact that the Fed eventually raised rates forced inflation to cool a bit quicker. But inflation possesses no magical momentum. The government stopped printing and pumping in free trillions, and the inflation began to halt all on its own. But whatever the case, the era of Powell as the undisputed, solitary leader has drawn to a close. And as one epoch gives way to another, amidst much creaking and scandal, the political stakes are rocketing sky high. Now, the entire world's attention, the gaze of every Wall Street broker and global government, is firmly fixed on one man, Kevin Warsh, the new chairman of the Fed. Who exactly is Kevin Warsh? The Nobel laureate, renowned economist, and former New York Times columnist Paul Krugman did not mince his words, publicly branding Warsh on national television as Donald Trump's sock puppet. A man whose sole directive is to follow orders from the Oval Office. Whilst giving his mandatory testimony before the Senate Banking Committee during his confirmation process, Warsh tried with all his might to prove his independence. Replying to rigorous questioning from Louisiana Republican John Kennedy, Warsh stated under oath, "Senator, the President has never asked me to predetermine, fix, or decide on interest rates in any of our discussions. And I assure you, I would never agree to do so." Yet the cynics in Washington merely scoff. Trump didn't need to ask Warsh for anything behind closed doors. Trump governs via the media. He has already declared loudly to the entire globe, via his social media feeds and at his rallies, that he will be bitterly, furiously disappointed if Kevin Warsh does not slash rates at the earliest possible opportunity. The signal has been broadcast loud and clear. Warsh knows exactly what is expected of him. For those experts who genuinely doubt whether Warsh possesses the mettle, the political heft, and the backbone to withstand White House pressure, his other public remarks are rather alarming. Speaking to Wall Street's fiercest critic, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren, Warsh made a startling declaration. "I believe the Federal Reserve in recent years has wandered far outside its remit. It has strayed into other lanes, dabbling in climate risks and social inequality. That is not something I'm prepared to do as chairman." Warsh is no novice in the world of finance. He is a Wall Street veteran who previously sat on the Fed's Board of Governors from 2006 to 2011, going through the crucible of the great financial crisis. He has already dropped heavy hints about impending tectonic shifts. Warsh intends to completely overhaul how the Fed manages its gargantuan portfolio of government bonds amassed during the years of quantitative easing, alter the data metrics the central bank relies upon, and significantly tighten the leash on public statements made by Fed officials. Warsh himself assumes the most powerful financial post in the world as a man of absolute financial independence. His personal fortune is estimated at somewhere between $135 to $220 million, largely thanks to a highly advantageous marriage to an heiress of the Estee Lauder empire. He does not need the money. What he craves is power and a place in the history books. However, the problem for Warsh, and indeed for Trump, is that the new chairman is not a dictator. He inherits a massive, highly inertial Federal Reserve Board of Directors. And it is highly unlikely that this board will instantly and cravenly roll over to satisfy Trump's desires at Warsh's very first meeting in June, just at the snap of his fingers. Let us look at the bare maths. It is simply a fact. Out of the 12 voting members of the committee, 7 governors in Washington and 5 regional bank presidents, the vote at the last meeting in April split 8-4. 8 individuals voted to hold rates firmly at their previous high level, completely ignoring the president's shouting. And do not forget, sitting amongst those 8 people in June will be Jerome Powell himself. An ordinary governor now, but one wielding colossal moral authority. Warsh simply will not be able to ram through a rate cut if the economic data isn't screaming for one. Furthermore, economic data is turning increasingly grim for those banking on cheap credit. Warsh's predicament is compounded by the fact that the genuine economic arguments for lowering interest rates in 2026 have dwindled significantly. Why? Geopolitics. Specifically, the escalating, unpredictable war in the Middle East, particularly the direct conflict involving Iran. War means supply disruptions. Disruptions mean scarcity. Surging oil and energy prices on global markets are, even now, pushing the inflation curve upwards, causing petrol at the pump in the States to rise week by week. Under these conditions, an interest rate cut from the Fed would be like throwing petrol onto an inflationary bonfire. If Warsh slashes rates now, he risks going down in history as the man who allowed hyperinflation to annihilate the savings of the American people, merely to appease Donald Trump's ego. This week, as the transition of power at the Fed became a fait accompli, final assessments of Jerome Powell's historical legacy have been pouring into the newspapers, one after another. His 8 long years at the helm of the global economy were not as terrifyingly dramatic or painful as the harsh measures of Paul Volcker, the legendary chairman who, in the early 80s, artificially induced a recession and hiked rates to 20% to break the spine of double-digit inflation. Powell's years were not as cinematic as the crisis years of Ben Bernanke, 2006 to 2014, who had to rescue the global banking system from total collapse by inventing emergency trillion-dollar bailouts on the fly. And they certainly were not as boisterously free, nor as full of deregulation and irrational exuberance as the long epoch of Alan Greenspan, 1987 to 2006. But do you know what is arguably Jerome Powell's greatest, most historic merit? Throughout 2025 and 2026, the world witnessed an astonishing and frightening tableau. In an era when self-proclaimed masters of the universe, billionaires from Silicon Valley, media moguls, and giants of the tech industry cowardly succumbed to the administration's demands for fealty, fearing the loss of government contracts. In an era when fundamental, supposedly unshakable institutions of American society in education, media, and law were buckling, folding, or making shameful compromises under unprecedented political pressure. In that very era, Jerome Powell's lonely, stubborn fortitude looks quiet, devoid of pathos, but truly magnificent. His contribution to this dark, turbulent period of American democracy will be remembered not so much for his charts, his economic course, or his delay in raising rates. He will be remembered for his iron spine, for his cold, polite civility in response to threats of imprisonment, for his unbending principles as an institutionalist who believed that the central bank should serve mathematics and the people, rather than a king. Cynics on Wall Street are deeply skeptical that Kevin Warsh, who arrived in this position as the president's candidate, will be able to demonstrate that same stony independence. Yet Jay Powell himself, as he retreats into the shadow of an ordinary governor, is nobly giving his successor a chance. In one of his final interviews, Powell remarked, "I am not looking to be a high-profile dissident on the board. I am not planning to plot or scheme. In the Federal Reserve, there is only ever one chair. And now, that person is not me." We shall see if the new chairman can withstand this colossal blow. Can he protect your money from the politicians? That is where we conclude our investigation. Do not forget to write your detailed thoughts on this situation in the comments. Should a president have the power to sack the head of the central bank? Are Trump's actions justified? And make sure to hit that bell so you never miss our new releases. We shall continue to tell you the truth, which is so carefully hidden behind the dry figures of financial reports. Until next time.